Yeah, my name is Malin Holst. I have a company called York Osteoarchaeology. I hope you can see my cursor. Down here is my company logo, and we excavate and analyze human remains from archaeological sites, and all of our work is commercial. I also have a part-time senior lectureship at the University of York, and I work there 2 days a week and have done for over 20 years and undertake research and teach students there. And this project at Fewston, which I'll introduce in a minute, was undertaken in collaboration with the University of Durham as well, which you mentioned before. So one thing that's quite important to be aware of for everybody who's watching this is that I will be showing human remains. So if you find that upsetting or would prefer not to see that, then it's probably best not to attend this talk because that's what the talk will focus on. The reason why I'm interested in human remains is not because I'm morbid or something like that, but because I've always loved archaeology and I'm very interested in people. And I think it's only through the people themselves that we really understand um, the people of the past and how they acted and why they did what they did. And I also think we can sometimes give them a voice through our work and to our analysis of the human remains. So that's really why I'm passionate about analyzing human remains, and I think this talk will hopefully demonstrate that. I just give a brief timeline. I know you're all historians, so you're probably aware of this. Obviously, archaeology covers all periods from the Paleolithic to the post-medieval period, and it's this post-medieval period we'll be focusing on in this talk. Just to give a very brief background on post-medieval, the post-medieval period in Britain. Obviously, there was the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1536. Afterwards, there were still illegal Catholic burials. There was a lot of non-conformism, so people not conforming to the Anglican Church from the 17th century onwards. And then we are looking at the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th century, a lot of urbanization and people migrating from rural areas to the cities. And obviously the sort of cleft between the poor and the rich became greater during this period. Regarding post-medieval burials, what we see is fairly uniform Christian burials. They're inhumations, so unburned, with the head to the west and the feet to the east. So for the Day of Judgment, and in supine, so on their backs, extended positions, and they were often buried in shrouds or wooden coffins or lead coffins for the very rich. Often there was quite a lot of pressure on burial grounds, so one person was often, oh, sorry, just trying to admit someone. One person was often, one person's grave was intercutting with another one, and so people were often buried in stacks. And I've excavated quite a lot of family stacks, so up to 14 individuals buried on top of one another. Sometimes most of the time the burials were earth cut, but sometimes you also get crypts or brick vaults, but they tended to be the richer individuals. And there were funerary fashions, particularly in the Victorian period. And actually, those fashions are better at dating the burials than we can do with radiocarbon dating. So during this period, the fashions changed so much, and there were funerary fashion catalogues that we can actually date the coffins by the coffin furniture quite well, and also the coffin styles. One aspect that's really incredible about this period, which we don't see in previous periods, is that we have named individuals. So sometimes we find coffin plates or we have gravestones with the person's name, and from that we can look at the burial register and we can obtain death certificates, and that allows us to identify an insight into these people. For example, we might get information on their profession, what they died of, and who they were related to in the cemetery. So we can gain much more of an insight into their lives than we might do in earlier periods where we know so much less and we have to sort of try to ascertain it from the limited evidence we do have. So if we have all this evidence, documentary evidence, why are we actually looking at post-medieval cemeteries? And it was actually thought that there was no need for post-medieval cemeteries to be excavated archaeologically until the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, because it was thought that there was so much known that they didn't provide any value and they were of no archaeological value. And so all post-medieval cemeteries that were in the way of development were being cleared by crypt clearance companies. And then in 1991, a cemetery at Spitalfields in London was excavated by archaeologists. And it was the cemetery of Huguenots. And there were silk weavers, and it was found that there was so much information about this population that it was realized how valuable this is. And it took about 10 years to translate into archaeological practice that now, or since the early 2000s, it's the norm for archaeologists to excavate post-medieval cemeteries rather than crypt clearance companies. I should emphasize at this point that almost all excavations in Britain, over 95%, are commercial excavations. So we don't excavate cemeteries for fun or out of interest, but we excavate them because they're in the way of a housing development, or we've just excavated some skeletons in a churchyard in Yorkshire, for example, that where the church was so damp, and so the churchyard needed to be lowered to ensure that the church doesn't get so damp. So in those instances, we excavate human remains. So it's because development disturbs the remains rather than for any other reason. So why are such post-medieval cemeteries important? I think they provide a really good link between the medieval period and the modern day, and they do aid in the understanding of the origins and development of diseases. Some diseases that we don't really see in the First World today can be seen much more in skeletons in the past. And I've worked with consultants at hospitals who have only seen some of the diseases that we see in archaeological skeletons if they worked for Medics Without Borders in third world countries, for example. And we've had sometimes quite long discussions about the causes of some of the diseases we see because they just don't see them anymore. So it might aid in understanding the origins of some diseases. Obviously, the impact of urbanization and the Industrial Revolution, the high migration, the population density, the pollution, and so on, needs to be investigated. And the records that we do have from burial grounds and death certificates and so on from the past can provide us some information about the diseases that might not be seen in the skeleton. But it has to be remembered that a lot of diseases were misdiagnosed in the past, of course. And then also, as I mentioned before, we try to give a voice to people in the past. And often it's the wealthy and influential that were able to, that made it into the historical records, not the poor, not the laborers, and so on. And obviously the poor are the ones who suffered the most from severe diseases. So we are under recording those in history, and that's nothing against the historians. There are other benefits. If we have a coffin plate, for example, we might know the age and sex of the individual, and we can actually analyze them blind, so analyze them without knowing their age and sex, and then test our methods. We can also look at family relationships. And sometimes we can also rectify history. And I actually analyzed an aristocratic crypt. I won't say here where from, but uh, it had very detailed. There were very detailed records on all the individuals in that crypt, and they were related to the aristocrat who owned the crypt. And there was a Colonel Henry who had died allegedly in a fencing duel, but when I analysed his skeleton, he was shot in the back. So we can sometimes sort of revise what was said in the past. So I talk today about Fewston. And Fewston is located here. It's a tiny little hamlet. It was a bigger village in the past, and it's sort of between Otley and Harrogate near a place called Blubberhouses, not very attractive name, and it's in North Yorkshire, so pretty much fairly central here in the north of England. It was a community that was characterized by farmers, stonemasons, blacksmiths, laborers, and so on. So typical rural community. Although one individual emigrated to the United States and he became a very important preacher and really wealthy, and he sent the New York Times to this tiny village once a month. So they were informed about parts of the world. I was really astounded by this, and I totally misjudged and was quite prejudiced by this previously. Two chaps from the village emigrated to Australia in the 19th century and didn't like it and came back. So there was some knowledge of the global wider world in this village. The church at Fewston is the Church of St. Michael and St. Lawrence, and it dates from the medieval period, from the 13th century, but actually it burned down later on, and only the tower remains from that period. And the church was rebuilt in the 17th century. And it's a very pretty place. If you like going for a walk, there's a reservoir there nearby, which is really pretty and worth walking round. So the reason why we were excavating in the churchyard was because the local community applied to build a heritage centre in the churchyard, and this is what it looks like now. It's a very beautiful heritage centre. They serve tea and coffee there on the weekend and have lots of events there. And in order to make room for this heritage centre, the graveyard had to be dug, and for that they applied for heritage lottery funding and received the funding. So the excavation started in 2009, and I was actually on the excavation just for one day. I was just having cancer treatment at the time, so I couldn't dig there much. But the north and west part of the churchyard was excavated under the direction of John Buglas, who's shown here. And some of the people from the community volunteered on the excavation. And in fact, these two ladies here, we've been working with ever since. And I should say really that there are two stories here. There's the story of the excavation and the burials and what we found out from them, but there's also the story of the community. And I'll focus a bit less on that, but they are somewhat interwoven. So I will tell you both of these stories. You can see that the topsoil was removed with an excavator, but the rest was excavated by hand. And some of the burials were just plain earth-cut burials, such as this child here, and others were in brick vaults. We think that almost all the burials were post-medieval, But many burials didn't have coffins. They were just buried in shrouds, so they could have been earlier. We don't exactly know the date. There were lots of different burial types. As I said, shrouds, earth-cut graves, some wooden coffins, some stone brick vaults. And what we found really interesting was that there was glass over the face of a couple of the coffins. So this is a sort of replica, not of this particular coffin, but I found it on the internet. And I don't know whether that was either to have a wake without opening the coffin or whether it was obviously sometimes people were perhaps thought to be dead and they were not really actually deceased. So whether they could make themselves known that they were still alive through that window. There was also a lot of coffin furniture, and this is one of the coffins from Fewston, so some were incredibly well preserved, but preservation really varied of the coffins and also of the skeletons, depending on it must have been dreadful to be a grave digger there. It was all cut in rock, and depending on how deep in the rock the burials were, the preservation depended on that. We also had some really interesting artifacts, and artifacts are not commonly found in Christian burials, so this was really lovely to have them. We had socks, and we had a few coins, and we had some rings, including wedding bands. There were some people buried in clothing, so we had buttons and so on. And one of the most amazing things you can see here on the bottom right was a wig, which had preserved, which is really impressive. And we also found floral tributes in some of the graves. There were 21 named individuals, and that's 13% or just under 14% of individuals. Roland Majerison, he was only 10 months old, but you can see based on this chart here, when the people were born and when they died, and that there were people there who were 84 years old. So there was a lot of longevity with some people, and you can see quite a lot of them were quite elderly, but obviously other people did die quite young. And we did know that there were their names through gravestone or through coffin plates, such as this one here of Eliza Wigglesworth. We analysed the skeletons, and it was one of my team, Anwen Cafell, who analysed the remains. Here on the left, you can see the graveyard and the distribution of burials, and that's the church here. You can also see that some skeletons had an autopsy performed on them, or craniotomy. So we excavated and analysed 154 skeletons. And as I said, we think that all of them, or most of them, dated to the post-medieval period, but we don't know that for certain. And we analysed these commercially, and we were paid by the Heritage Lottery Fund for that analysis. Now, what is really incredible about this particular assemblage is that we have a diary of the son of two of our skeletons. He was called John Dickinson, and he wrote the diary of a Timbleman, or Timbleman, diaries of a dalesman. And frankly, a lot of it is about his love life and what he ate. But it's very interesting. And he does describe his mother's death. And during the skeletal analysis, Anwen, who analysed the skeletons, was reading the diaries and came across this part in the diary, which dates from the 6th of March of 1886 of John Dickinson's mother, which is really quite incredible. And there are some other individuals listed here that were actually whose skeletons we have. So we have John Dickinson's mother's and father's skeletons amongst their named assemblage. So that was a really important part and gave a really unique insight to this assemblage that we don't ever normally have, and the diary covers almost 40 years. What was also really quite incredible is how engaged the community was. So We had numerous descendants of the dead, and this one is one of them. As Mervyn Lister, but he's the great, 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 great grandson of George Lister, who was just mentioned in the diary before. And he was very actively involved, as were numerous other living descendants of the dead. We also have a really strong community interest, and in fact, the community were allowed or we involved them in the skeletal analysis so they could see the skeletons of their ancestors. They could, if they wanted, obviously, and they could learn how we determine the age and the sex and pathology of the skeletons. And this is some of the community here at Durham University with some of the skeletons and some of the PhD students, the doctorate students who worked on the assemblage, undertaking further research, showing them how we analyze skeletons. So that was a really important aspect. And again, a really unique aspect, because normally when we excavate and analyze skeletons, the community isn't very engaged, or there's no community who could be engaged. So what can skeletal analysis tell us? We can only see long-standing diseases in skeletons, and we can only see some diseases. So, for example, with tuberculosis, we can only see that in around 3% of instances, because it doesn't usually affect the skeleton, and the same with leprosy or venereal syphilis. So we are underestimating disease a lot. We can see bone trauma, so fractures or people being killed with a sword or something like that. We can see metabolic conditions if they are long-standing, such as rickets or scurvy, but often people die of them before they affect the skeleton. And then similarly with some cancers, if they metastasize and affect the skeleton, then we can see it, and dental disease as well. That's the best, really. We can usually see dental disease. But often people died before they were affected by disease. So we don't see that many diseases. Now here we have two graphs, and I promise I won't show too many graphs, but these are the children's skeletons from Fewston. So here's the percentage, and you can see the children, and then here you can see the adults, and I'll mention which acronyms which first. So here we have the perinates, so they're around the age of just birth, so just before, after birth. So we have a very small proportion, and a very small proportion of infants as well, where we would really expect quite a lot of children, because obviously birth is quite a precarious time. These are the younger juveniles, and they make up almost a quarter of the children's population. So they are 1 to 6 years old. That's when we normally see a high incidence of death, because children get chest infections, or they suffer from diarrhea and so on. So they tend to, or get measles, something like that. They tend to be our most sort of best represented group, but not here. There are a lot of older juveniles who are aged 7 to 12, and a lot of adolescents who are aged 13 to 18, and then some we couldn't age more closely because they were too badly preserved. But adolescents don't really tend to die very much, other than of risk taking. That tends to be sort of the highest death rate, or tuberculosis during this period. So a bit odd. We have the red ones are females here, and the blue ones are males in this chart on the bottom right. And these are the 18 to 25-year-olds, the young adults. We don't have many, and we've got slightly more females that could be related to childbirth. The 26 to 35-year-olds are our young middle adults. We don't have many of those, which is what you would expect. We have a few more old middle adults, which are 36 to 45-year-olds. And then this is our mature adult age group. And you can see that there's quite a lot of them. We have a real issue with aging skeletons at this age or older skeletally. And we can't age them beyond 46 years, because the genes and aging wear and tear have such a different effect on different individuals, that anyone over the age of 46 is called a mature adult. And of course, they could be, like we saw in our named individuals, they could be 84 years old, but they might just be 47. So that's a real limit of osteology, and it's so brilliant to have those named individuals. And then because some skeletons were poorly preserved, they're just adults, they're just 18 years old or older, but we can't age them any further. These are our named individuals, and you can see that actually most of them live to, a better age, an older age than 46. A lot of people were aged 60 plus or 70 plus. And the men there in our little sample tended to survive better to older age than the women. And that might be related to the sort of stresses of pregnancy and childbirth. I've compared our population from Fewston, the living height, with some of the other populations that we've analysed from this period from urban areas. And you can see that the men are particularly tall, they're taller than anyone else. The women are sort of taller than most. So the fact that they were tall suggests that they were probably quite well nourished. So the men, the average height was 6'2", which is, yeah, quite tall, and the female average height was 5'3". We have some dental disease there. So we have loss of teeth during life, and they might have just been shed naturally because the gums were receding, or people might have had their teeth pulled out. And we've got these notches in the teeth, and they occur if you habitually smoke a pipe and hold it between your clenched teeth. Pipe smoking was obviously quite common during this period, in all classes really, or at least tobacco consumption. We have a lot of cavities as well. You can see, poor dental health there. Dental health is quite poor, especially in the late 19th century, because the sugar tax was abolished around 1850, and you suddenly see this spike in sugar consumption, and I think we're all guilty of it now, but you can see that it really affected the teeth with a lot of cavities quite adversely during this period. Sorry. We also have seen other pathologies, so developmental, so that could be congenitally. If people had really severe congenital anomalies, for example, water on the brain, they wouldn't have survived infancy. But if they were less severe, then they survived it. And here you can see that there's scoliosis, or curvature of the spine. This was in an older individual, so they lived throughout their life with this curvature in the spine. But most of the anomalies we saw were relatively minor, but there were some more major, slightly more detrimental ones in some of the children we saw, and perhaps a larger incidence than we might normally see. We also saw some trauma, so that might be crush fractures of the vertebrae if somebody fell from a height and landed on their feet or their bottom. You can see that here in the spine, that vertebra is really flattened compared to that one. Breaks in the legs here. This is the ankle, so there's a break there and there. And that might be being kicked by a cow or being run over by a cart or something like that. We also see a little bit of some interpersonal violence. There's a broken nose here that's well healed in this individual, but most of it was accidental trauma. And of course, in a rural community, you would expect, have to have crushed feet from a cow standing on your foot and things like that. We also see age-related wear and tear, so tooth loss, as I mentioned before. John Dickinson in his diary mentions how he was on a diet of pretty much soup and porridge towards the end of his life. So as I said, he was very keen on writing about his food. And this pitting that's a vertebra of the neck that should look like that surface, but that pitting is just wear and tear of the neck of the in the spine. And then this shiny surface here, that's actually in the hip. That's the ball socket of the hip, and the shiny surface means that bone is rubbing on bone. So that's very typical in older people, elderly people, that you get osteoarthritis in different parts where you've lost the cartilage as a result of wear and tear or accidents. And rural life was obviously tough. And in fact, our John Dickinson, who wrote the diary, was a stonemason, but later did more clerical tasks as he was aging and couldn't undertake stonemasonry anymore. And we also have a lot of inflammation in bones, especially of the sinuses. So that could be pollution, that could be from animals, living with animals, hay, dust, and all that sort of dust. It could be cooking over an open fire. It could also be, it's very prevalent in urban areas and working in factories, but equally it can be very prevalent in rural areas. But there was also quite a lot of inflammation in other bones, such as the shin bones and other bones in this population. What we didn't expect, but what we saw a lot of, is rickets or vitamin D deficiency. And rickets is particularly common in urban areas where you have a lot of pollution during this period. So it's a lack of sunlight or lack of foods that are rich in vitamin D. So children that were working in mills all hours of the day and didn't see sunlight would have had it. And in urban areas, even the rich would have suffered from rickets because of the pollution. And it causes, it doesn't allow the bones to calcify properly. So the bones that are weight bearing start to bend because they're so soft. And that causes those bowing deformities. So we had a surprisingly high incidence of rickets, considering this is a rural population. And as we saw, a lot of people were quite tall, seemed quite well nourished. We also saw a lot of scurvy. So that's vitamin C deficiency. So that's related to food and not getting enough vitamin C from the food. And it causes sort of bleeding into the eye orbits. This is an eye orbit, or bleeding into the bones. And people who have scurvy, everything is very painful. So they children cry a lot, and they can't bear being touched. And both rickets and scurvy only manifest in skeletons of children. If an adult has these conditions, we wouldn't see them. During the post-medieval period, it was sometimes quite fashionable to bottle feed rather than to breastfeed. So we thought maybe it's that, but then we thought in rural populations, surely they would have breastfed. But the bottle feeding in that period often was cow's milk, which obviously isn't ideal for young children, and it can carry infectious diseases, especially if the bottle isn't sterilized. And also, often it was just water with flour, called pap, so not very nourishing. So we saw a lot of vitamin C deficiency, and then we saw these pitted lesions in the eye orbits of several skeletons, again, which are related to stress in childhood, and that's physical stress from disease and malnutrition rather than stress to a stressful period of time. So we were just really puzzled by this. This didn't really match what we thought about rural populations. Another thing that we saw a lot of is these lines or grooves in the teeth, and in this particular, they're really extreme. And they again suggest childhood stress, particularly in the first 7 years of life. So again, malnutrition or disease. And basically what happens is that the child stops growing, so the teeth stop forming. And obviously you know that the permanent teeth are developing during this time. They just stop forming when the child is stressed. And then if the child survives that period of stress, the tooth continues to form, but often a line or groove develops as a result. But this is particularly extreme. And we see this, it's directly related with slum or poor populations. We can see it directly. So this was very puzzling. We also have a lot of inflammation in the lungs, particularly in the older children. These are the ribs. So the lungs are next to the ribs, so we can see inflammation, which you can see here on this grey woven bone, we call it, in the ribs, and the green and pink represent left and right ribs. So in the older juveniles, so the 7 to 12-year-olds and the adolescents, we have it, and in the females particularly. And that could be pneumonia, or it could be tuberculosis or another lung infection. So all really odd. So within this community at Fewston, we all got together. There were lots of volunteers, the descendants of the skeletons, the people who'd applied for the HLF bid, who all got together with us from this is Anman here who analysed the skeleton. That's my colleague Becky Gowlin from Durham University, and Michelle Alexander from York University, and we all got together on numerous community meetings. I don't know how many times I've been to Fewston. I should think at least 50 times. And we met every month and discussed this. What is going on here? We've got the diary, we have the skeletons, we've got the artifacts, we've got the coffin plates, we've got some historical evidence, we've got some death certificates of those 21 individuals. So we decided to investigate this further and do more analysis. And we did that as a team, as a community. And I have to say that was one of the most satisfying aspects of this. So you saw this unusual age distribution with this high incidence of 7 to 12-year-olds and 13 to 18-year-olds. And you saw that we had so much rickets, scurvy, and other forms of childhood stress. So my colleague Becky Gowland and one of the volunteers, Gillian Waters, they with a team of the community undertook some research into the burial records during that time. And they found that between 1815 and 1824, there's a marked increase in deaths of the 13 to 19-year-olds, which are shown in black here. And that was a period when the Westhouse Mill at Blubber House, which is close by, which is a flax and silk mill, was particularly it was a particularly active period for this mill. So 29 adolescents died during this period. So that was quite interesting. And we have a very high incidence of adolescent deaths anyway during this period, which is unusual. My colleague Michelle Alexander, who's shown here at the University of York, looked at the adolescents, the teenagers, and the children from that period, and she looked at the diet, and for that you look at the ribs, pardon me, and you analyze this using biomolecular techniques, and she found that the results suggest that the children didn't consume much, and adolescents didn't consume much meat. Whereas the adults, especially our named individuals that we knew were local to the village, consumed much more protein-rich diet. And then our colleagues in Durham undertook other types of isotope analysis, strontium and oxygen isotope analysis, and they found that our named individuals all came from the same sort of local area, but our kids, the teenagers, mostly came from a different area. And we have Daniel Fox here. He's from Ireland. He's a bit different. He's got different isotopes, but that's not surprising. And that helped actually to establish. We thought this individual was Daniel Fox. But the strontium and oxygen isotopes suggested more Southern English sort of origin. Oops, I think, sorry, I've given everything away now. So we undertook some more historical research, and we found that in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were five mills in the Washburn Valley where Fewston is located, and they were involved in processing flax, cotton, and silk. And one of those mills was the largest mill in the Yorkshire Dales. And we have accounts of child labour in these mills. There was a Reverend Robert Collier who actually his wrote up his memories, and he was a pauper apprentice, so an individual whose parents had also been conscripted really to this mill, um, and um, and they were from Norwich and London. And Robert was born to these parents who were forced to work in this mill and worked there from the ages of 8 and 14. And we have some records here also of other children that sent their from workhouses or parishes who sent children to the mill at Fewston. So we found out that actually children were forced from workhouses in London, in Southwark, and Lambeth. They were forced to move to the mill at blubber houses and work in this flax, cotton, or silk mill in blubber houses. The flax mill was active in the late 19th and early late 18th and early 19th century, and the silk mill in the mid 19th century. And the youngest apprentices were around 7 years, but most were 10 to 13 years. And this is from Robert Collier's memoirs. Rang in at 6 in the morning and out at 8 in the evening, just to remember that he was there from a very young age, with an hour for dinner and a rest. And if he got a chance to sit down for a few moments when the overlooker wasn't around to lay his leathern strap on our small shoulders, and the result of this was that weaker children were so crippled. And this is the mill here. So we found out that these children that we'd seen skeletally as having stress indicators, as having rickets, scurvy, dying younger than they should, at ages when they really shouldn't, were forced to work in the mills and really long hours, and obviously succumbed. Some of them succumbed to this dreadful period of time. The evidence really, the stress markers, the documentary evidence, the poor growth in the children, the carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis, and the strontium and oxygen isotope analysis together provided really concrete evidence for these being pauper apprentices. And I think without any strand of this, it wouldn't have been possible to tell a story. So then we were left with what should we do with this information? So we had more and more community meetings going on from there. You can see here the whole team again continuing to meet. So we decided to create some outputs, and the community were particularly active in doing this. This was much more them than us. They created this really professionally produced popular booklet that one can buy at the Washburn Heritage Centre. They created a Washburn Heritage Centre website, which is really excellent. We, as a group, created numerous exhibitions in the Heritage Centre. I don't know how many, more than 10. We gave lots and lots of talks on our results. We were consistently collaborating with the community. We also created reconstructions of 2 of our skeletons. I think it was George Lister. This is George Lister, and also I think Eliza Wigglesworth. One of the very talented community members created this beautiful christening gown made out of cotton and silk as a sort of dedication to the children of the mill. And she also embroidered the names of some of the known. We didn't have any named individuals from the pauper apprentices, but she researched the pauper apprentices at the mills and found some of the names and embroidered them into this apron. We also created a film, and you can watch the film on the website. And this is actually George Lister's descendant talking about his ancestors. And we wrote a book as well, an accessible book. One thing that felt really important as part of this project, I think to me it was one of the most meaningful things, was that we created this patchwork here. And I'm useless at any handicraft, unfortunately, but people from the community and many of the researchers each created one patch for the patchwork for each of the 154 skeletons. So every single skeleton does have one of these patches, and they're organized by age here. And this wall hanging is in the Washburn Heritage Centre. I find it very moving, I think. And it includes a picture for each skeleton that's not necessarily meaningful to that particular individual. But obviously some of the community members researched a particular individual of the named skeletons and then created one of these patches. And there's a patch for every named and every unnamed individual. So that's Mary Dickinson. So she's the mother of John Dickinson, so the man who wrote the diary. But there are also other individuals who don't have a name. So I think it's really moving, and in my view, we've tried as much as we possibly could to give a voice to all these individuals. But the story doesn't stop there. So we also reburied all the individuals. And I think that was one of the most moving parts and the most, it really also sounds perhaps odd, but satisfying parts of this project. It was incredible. The archaeologists who excavated the skeletons originally dug the graves for the reburial. So there was a sort of full circle there. This is Mervyn Lister, the descendant of the skeletons, providing a eulogy in the church during the funeral service for the individuals. We had a local basket weaver who wove one of the coffins for the reburial, and Unwin who analyzed the skeleton, and John Buglas, the excavator, put the individual into the grave, placed the individual into the grave, and the researchers all attended the reburial service. The local community actually wrote a poem about the skeletons, and they made it into a song, and they sang the song during this reburial service, which was attended by all the community and the descendants of the dead and the researchers. The two of the volunteers also baked Victorian funeral biscuits for the reburial, so which provided even more of a sort of connection with the past. And you can see here that this is at the Heritage Centre. Tea and coffee and cake were a very big part of this project, and still are, in fact. So everybody had afternoon tea together. And there's a legacy here. Here are some of the researchers with the exhibition of the reconstructions in the Washburn Heritage Centre. Obviously, we've produced the accessible booklets and so on. The christening gown is exhibited. We've also written some peer-reviewed articles on this, but we actually just had another meeting, and you can see again lots of cake. The Fewston community is amazing at baking. We had another meeting just last month in February of 2025 to consider the legacy of this. And in fact, we are thinking of applying for another community heritage lottery fund to think about how to write up the legacy and to think about the future of this and what to do with it. And we are considering teachers' packs so that school children will learn about what we found out about the past. And I think a lot of school children today can probably connect with some of the feelings of the disadvantaged in the past. And we've also been contacted by indigenous communities in other parts of the world who were so moved by our community collaboration that they want us to write it up with them and to see whether we could provide a sort of I guess an idea of how one can work with a community on such a sensitive project. So this isn't the end. This is it is continuing. And again, here you can see Anne Caffel, who analyzed the skeletons, and Becky Gowland and Michelle Alexander from the universities, but also all the community members. And unfortunately, some of them have passed away since the project, but their legacy does live on. So I would very much like to thank both the skeletons that we were privileged to excavate and analyze and rebury, and the descendants of the dead, and also all the volunteers who worked so hard on this project for this incredible project. Sorry, that's my cat. It's just walked in. That was good timing.